of you and to study your word. I pray that you'll bless this time together as we study and that this message is edifying and can bring glory to your name. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. All right. Unfortunately, we do not have the screens, so I can't show you the text or images and so forth, but we'll just have to make do, unfortunately, again. So we are continuing our study of Samuel. Last time we talked about the first time that David ends up sparing Saul's life. That was 1 Samuel 13, 15 to 24, 22. And this week is going to be chapter 25, which is the story of Nabal. And the sort of tentative title that I'm going with, and I have to admit I kind of stole this from some other guy's website because it was just too good, but I'm going to go in a different direction than he did. The title for the chapter is going to be A Story of Two Fools. It's just too good. It's too good of a title. So we got two fools in this story. Keep that in mind. And then, of course, because I pepper my slides with pictures and quotes and so on, to kind of lead off this discussion, there's the famous scene, for those who watch movies and so forth, from the Batman movie, A Dark Knight, where the attorney who ends up becoming Two-Face, he famously says, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And this isn't always true, but it does seem to hold true in a lot of instances. And we definitely see this a lot in the Bible, where you'll have a character who is raised up to be a hero, and through disobedience or whatnot ends up becoming the villain of his own story. Probably the most famous example of this is Saul himself, right? He starts off as the hero, and he starts off decently, but he descends into villainy. And unfortunately, we even see David at times, right? He's supposed to be the hero, but there are instances where we kind of see this villain aspect of him appear. And chapter 25 is one of those moments. So just something to kind of keep in mind, in the back of our heads. So the chapter begins with verse 1. Samuel died, and all Israel assembled to mourn for him, and they buried him by his home in Ramah. Right off the bat, right? This is kind of bad news, because Samuel, right, the whole book begins with his birth, the prophecy right, regarding his mother and Eli, and now he's gone. This very centralizing figure, this one who has, his life is what's really kind of been the glue of this whole story. He was there before Saul. He oversaw all of Saul's early reign, and then he was there to replace Saul with David. And he's sort of been the kind of spiritual overseer of Israel during this time. The fact that he's gone bodes very ill for Israel, right? And now we're entering into a period where we still have these kind of two anointed figures. We still have Saul, who's crazy, somewhere in the background. And now we have David running off and doing his thing, but we no longer have any kind of spiritual force that's holding Israel together. So we're now entering into a dark period for Israel, unfortunately, because there's no spiritual leader to hold everything together. We could say, well, what about the priests? Well, unfortunately, Saul's already killed the priests. So there's no prophet figure to hold Israel together, and we know the priests are all in disarray. We do have Abiathar, but he's aligned with David, and so Israel's just becoming increasingly more chaotic politically, culturally, and so on. So the fact that Samuel is gone bodes very poorly for the future of the country. And then it continues that David then went down to the wilderness of Paran. This is an odd thing to include, and I can't show you slides, unfortunately, but in chapter 23, we know that David has been kind of running around on the eastern side of Judah. We know that he was in Ziph, and he was kind of, he's going all around. He ends up on the western side of the Dead Sea, right? He ends up in En-Gedi. But he's been staying in the general area of the, again, eastern side of Judah. The wilderness of Paran, does anybody know where that is? It's not even in Israel. It's in the Sinai Peninsula. That's one of the areas that the Hebrews go through on their way to the Promised Land. So this creates a kind of a dilemma for us because we've already seen David try to leave Israel, and he was chastised for that. So why is it okay for him to leave now? This would be kind of to the southwest of Judah. Some have theorized that wilderness of Paran is a more general term, or that there's another location that was associated with Paran, and it would be in southern Judah. So it seems odd that he would leave Israel, but at the same time, it's hard not to associate this with the place that the Hebrews went through during the Exodus. So it's just kind of confusing, and it's just not clear where he is right now. So then in verse 2, the story kind of shifts and really picks up with the introduction of a new person. So a man in Maon had a business in Carmel. So David had already been in the vicinity of Maon in the previous chapter, which is why it's odd that he would be in that area. We know that he was kind of forced towards the Dead Sea, and then he heads down perhaps south of Judah, and now he's made his way back. It's possible. We're just missing information, apparently. But for some reason, or whatever has happened between then and now, he is back in the area of Maon. There is more than one place called Carmel. Carmel here is in Judah. It's a nearby hill, so apparently he had a business that covered the area all around Maon. And it goes on, he was very rich with 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and was shearing his sheep in Carmel. The man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name Abigail. The woman was intelligent and beautiful, but the man, a Calebite, was harsh and evil in his dealings. So this is quite the introduction, right? We're introduced to a couple. The man is very, very wealthy. The introduction, of course, is that the man is not even foolish, he's just evil. He's a harsh man, a foolish man, or an evil man. We are told he's a Calebite. That's significant. And we're told that his wife is intelligent. This is not the first time that we've been introduced to a couple where the husband is less than intelligent and the wife is intelligent. Probably the most significant couple I can think of off the top of my head would be Manoah and his wife, right? The parents of Samson. Manoah's wife, who's never named, seems to be rather intelligent, right? She's the one that the angel appears to and tells you're going to be pregnant and all these things are going to happen, and she seems to grasp what's going on. She seems to grasp the prophecy and the significance of it, but then the husband wants affirmation. He wants proof. He wants to question the angel and all of this, and he even goes to the angel, and the angel's like, what, I already told your wife. Why are you asking me? Just go ask your wife. And then when the angel disappears, like, oh, we're going to die, and his wife's like, if the angel wanted to kill us, we'd already be dead. Like, fair point. So this is not the first time that we've seen a smart woman married to a dumb guy. But he is wealthy, so, sometimes wealth doesn't, make up for things. So in verse 4, while David was in the wilderness, this is perhaps not the wilderness of Paran. This might be the wilderness outside of Maon. So he's perhaps made his way back, or again, Paran is just a larger area than we sometimes associate with. But he's in the wilderness. He heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So David sent 10 young men, instructing them, go up to Carmel, and when you come to Nabal, greet him in my name. Now, we may wonder, why is David doing this? Well, it probably comes back to to Nabal being a Calebite. Because if we remember correctly, Caleb is from the tribe of Judah, right? Caleb was the one who ends up taking over as the leader of Judah once they come back into the land, once they enter in the land. And then it's passed off to Othniel and so on. David is not actually descended from Caleb, at least not in the official genealogies, but he is, of course, of the tribe of Judah. So presumably they would be cousins on some level. So he's a fellow Judite. And what David is probably saying is, go to this guy, tell him who I am, tell him who my family is, and tell him we need help, right? As a wealthy man and as someone who is somewhat related, presumably, even though it's not spelt out here, David is expecting this guy to offer assistance, right, because of the family. So in verse 6, then say this, long life to you and peace to you, to your family, and to all that is yours. I hear that you are shearing. When your shepherds were with us, we did not harass them. and nothing of theirs was missing the whole time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. So let my young men find favor with you, for we have come on a feast day. Please give whatever you can afford to your servants and to your son David. Let's just take a moment and kind of let that sink in. What? What exactly is David saying here? He's saying to his distant relative, who, whatever connection they have, we don't really know. He's sending his men, right? His armed, military-aged men who probably have weapons. Hey, remember we group of guys that happened to be in the vicinity of your men when they were shearing the sheep? We didn't harass you. And because we didn't harass you, we feel we are entitled to some of your property. You can't see my picture. I have a picture from a Goodfellas movie. I mean, this sounds like a mafia shakedown. This is almost absurd, right? Like, you generally don't reward someone for not robbing you. And that's kind of what David is saying. Now, maybe he could have phrased it better, or maybe he could have been less imposing, but that is kind of how it's coming across. Like, I could just rob you, but I'm not. And the fact that I haven't robbed you makes me a good person. So because I'm a good person, you should give me some of your stuff. I don't know how any of you feel, but if a distant relative just showed up one day and like, hey, I could rob you, but I didn't rob you, so you should give me something, I don't think you would take this very kindly. So yeah, this does not put David in the best light. Now, I think we're going to get some context for this, and the story's going to be fleshed out some, but this is a rough start to this story. Again, it doesn't really put David in a positive light. So verse 9, David's young men went and said all these things to Nabal on David's behalf, and they waited. Nabal asked him, who is David? Who is Jesse's son? Many slaves these days are running away from their masters. Am I supposed to take my bread, my water, and my meat that I butchered for my shears and give them to these men? I don't know where they are from. So now it could be that he genuinely doesn't know who David is, that they're so far removed relationally or whatever that he doesn't know. I doubt that's the case. David is famous, right? David has made a name for himself. He's the hero of Israel. And he has this reference to all these slaves that are running away. It's quite likely that he knows David's on the run from Saul. He knows that David is essentially a traitor, right? He's been branded a rebel. He's been branded an outcast. And here's David running around with his ragtag band of merry men and kind of playing hero, like with Kayla and so on. And Nabal, for whatever reason, maybe he sided with Saul, maybe he genuinely sees David as a traitor or whatever, but he just doesn't think that he owes David anything. Now, of course, we know that David's the anointed one, that David's the hero, David's the good guy, and so on. And because he is the anointed, because he is the one that's serving Yahweh, it is on the obligation of the Israelites to help David in his time of need. I'm not saying that it isn't. I'm saying David is not approaching this in a great way, and we might understand contextually why Nabal might be on the fence. Again, also, we know Nabal's not the greatest guy, right? It's already introduced that he's kind of evil, he's kind of foolish. But we can at least contextualize where Nabal's coming from. So in verse 12, David's men retraced their steps. When they returned to him, they reported all these words. He said to his men, all of you, put on your swords. So David and all his men put on their swords. About 400 men followed David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. So Nabal has rejected David's offer. So David's not very happy. And so now he's going to go back, fully armed, to have another conversation with Nabal. Again, this feels an awful lot like a mafia shakedown. Like, the mafia shows up, and they're like, hey, it's a nice store. It'd be terrible if something happened to it. And so you tell them, buzz off. And then they come back next time, and they're not asking. They come back with bats or guns or whatever, because they're going to teach you a lesson. This, again, puts David in an increasingly negative light. And what's particularly disappointing about this is if we go back to chapter 22, so in chapter 22, verse 6, Saul says, Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered. At that time, Saul was in Gibeah, sitting under the tamarisk tree at the high place. His spear was in his hand. All his servants were standing around him. Saul said to his servants, listen, men of Benjamin, is Jesse's son going to give you all of your fields and vineyards? Do you think he'll make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? And he goes on, not just here, but elsewhere, where he basically accuses David of being a traitor. And he's like, David's off playing hero, and he's actually a traitor. So by doing this, it seems like David really is kind of playing into Saul's narrative, that he's kind of being the villain here, that he takes what he wants, that he's not really the hero, that he presented himself in Keilah, that when someone offends him or when someone doesn't give him what he wants, he just takes it. He's not Robin Hood, he's just an outlaw. And that's not the way we want to perceive David. So this puts him in a very negative light. Like, things just keep getting worse for David. So in verse 14, one of Nabal's young men informed Abigail, Nabal's wife, look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, but he yelled at them. The men treated us well. When we were in the field, we weren't harassed, and nothing of ours was missing the whole time. We were living among them. Then they were a wall around us, both day and night, the entire time we were herding the sheep. Now consider carefully what you must do, because there is certain to be trouble for our master and his entire family. He is such a worthless fool, nobody can talk to him. So we're getting a little more context. The way this is presented seems like David's men were either helping or protecting them, offering some sort of protection, although we didn't get that up front. And the servant here is telling Abigail that there's this confrontation coming, right? That David's men offered some sort of help, and they want some sort of restitution for it. Nabal doesn't want to do it, and now there's going to be an open conflict. Now, from Abigail's perspective, this is not a story with a hero and a villain, right? From Abigail's perspective, this is her foolish husband who's gotten in a bad situation with presumably a bad actor, right? Like, again, you're in with the loan sharks or something, and because your husband has done some foolish deeds or deals or whatever, they're coming to collect, and they're going to break his knees and maybe more. So she's trying to defuse the situation. Right? She only has a certain amount of information, and she just doesn't want this thing to escalate. But from her perspective, this is just her stuck between a rock and a hard place. She does not want open conflict between this band of outlaws, from her perspective again, and her husband who's instigated or just put fuel on the fire. So this is just a really, really bad situation. So then in verse 18, Abigail hurried, taking 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 butchered sheep, a bushel of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she said to her male servants, go ahead of me, I will be right behind you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. So she's not going to tell Nabal because she knows he'll stop her. But she's going to go and try and appease the situation. She's going to try and diffuse everything, right? She's going to, in her mind, to some extent, she's going to try and basically pay off David, just to get all of it out of the way. So in verse 20, as she rode the donkey down a mountain pass hidden from view, she saw David and his men coming toward her and met them. David had just said, I guarded everything that belonged to this man in the wilderness for nothing. He was not missing anything, yet he paid me back evil for good. May God punish me and do so severely if I let any of his men survive until morning. So this is getting even worse. Like, David is really mad. Not only that, but he's cursing Nabal. Now, how involved his men were, was there an agreement between he and Nabal, or he and Nabal's men? We don't know. There's maybe more context to this. But David really feels wronged. And the way Nabal's handling this is just making things worse. And the Bible makes it clear that Nabal's kind of an idiot, and he's kind of evil, so it's possible that Nabal has acted really badly in this transaction. But David's not handling it well either. Again, this is a story of 2 fools. And it also probably doesn't help that within the last couple of chapters, we've already seen David sort of mistreated by other cities. He was mistreated by the Keilah residents, right? They were going to turn him over to Saul right after he had saved them. He was going to be turned over by the Ziphites. So he's gone through a lot right now. And it's possible that this is just one more instance of someone who he thought was going to help him, who he tried to help or tried to offer assistance to, and now the guy's turned on him, and David has just had it. He's just done. He's tired of playing games. He's tired of running, and he feels like he deserves something. This is really, in my mind, just eerily similar to the story of Gideon. So going back to Gideon chapter 8, verse 4, Judges 8, verse 8, 4, Gideon and the 300 men came to the Jordan. This is right after Gideon had won the major battle, right? And so he's chasing the villain and his army. So he came to the Jordan, crossed it. They were exhausted but still in pursuit. He came to the men of Succoth. Please give some loaves of bread to the people who are following me because they are exhausted, for I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. But the princes of Succoth asked, hey, are Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hands that we should give bread to your army? Gideon replied, very well, when the Lord has handed Zebah and Zalmunna over to me, I will trample your flesh on thorns and briars from the wilderness. He went from there to Penuel and asked the same thing from them. The men of Penuel answered, just as the men of Succoth had answered. He also told the men of Penuel, when I return in peace, I will tear down this tower. So Gideon, who has just won this major battle, he's just become kind of the hero of Israel overnight, is now chasing these enemy kings, and on the way, he needs provisions. He needs rations for his men. So he goes to these two cities, and he asks for help. Gideon is acting as the judge of Israel, the hero of Israel, and he feels like, as the deliverer, they should help. But they don't want to help for whatever reason. And because they won't help, he's going to curse these two cities. So here is David, right, on the run from Saul. He's trying to help the locals, and time and again, he's mistreated, he's betrayed, and he gets to Nabal, and he's just at it. Nabal hasn't helped him. He's turned on him or whatever, and David's finally done it. He's going to curse Nabal. He's going to kill Nabal. He's going to do what Gideon did. This is not a good situation. This is a really, really bad situation. Then in verse 23, so we're back in 1 Samuel 25. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off the donkey and fell with her face to the ground in front of David. Verse 25. Verse 24. She fell at his feet and said, the guilt is mine, my lord. Please let your servant speak to you directly. Listen to the words of your servant. Verse 25. My lord should pay no attention to this worthless man Nabal, for he lives up to his name. His name is Nabal, and stupidity is all he knows. I, your servant, didn't see my lord's young men whom you sent. So she wasn't there for the deal. She didn't know what was going on, but she's willing to accept that whatever transpired was probably her husband's fault, because that's just the kind of the guy he is. From her perspective, she has no idea what's going on. But a soft word turns away wrath, right? She is going to diffuse the situation. From her mind, as far as she knows, David could be just as bad, could be just as guilty, but she wants to diffuse the situation. She wants to keep open bloodshed. She doesn't want her husband to die. She doesn't want her men to be killed. She doesn't want to lose all of her stuff, and so she's going to do whatever it takes to keep this from escalating any further, because she's a wise, intelligent woman. So she's the hero of this situation, right? The whole story. So then in verse 26, now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, it is the Lord who kept you from participating in bloodshed and avenging yourself by your own hand. May your enemies and those who want to trouble for my Lord be like Nabal. Accept this gift your servant has brought to my Lord, and let it be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive your servant's offense, for the Lord is certain to make a lasting dynasty for my Lord, because he fights the Lord's battles. Throughout your life, may evil not be found in you. Here, she seems to indicate that she has some knowledge of who David is, some knowledge of his background, and she wants to believe that David really is a good guy, that David is a hero, and as a hero, he shouldn't be behaving this way, right? He should be living up to his calling as the hero of Israel. He should be more merciful. He should be more understanding and not taking out personal vengeance, personal bloodshed against some idiot like Nabal. Again, she's a very intelligent and wise woman, and she wants to keep this from escalating. And then we get, it goes on, from verse 29. When someone pursues you and attempts to take your life, my Lord's life will be tucked safely in the place where the Lord your God protects the living. However, he will fling away your enemies' lives like stones from a sling. When the Lord does for my Lord all the good he promised and appoints you ruler over Israel, there will not be remorse or a troubled conscience for my Lord because of needless bloodshed or my Lord's revenge. And when the Lord does good things for my Lord, may you remember me, your servant. So again, she's appealing to David. She's appealing to him as the hero, as possibly the next ruler of Israel, that as the ruler, as the one who's going to take over, he needs to show justice. He needs to show mercy. He can't be offended at every slight, and he can't just kill people willy-nilly just because they offend him, right? He has to live up to some of these things. So then we get verse 32. This is it. Then David said to Abigail, "Praise to the Lord God of Israel, who sent you to meet me today. Your discernment is blessed, and you are blessed. Today you kept me from participating in bloodshed and avenging myself by my own hand. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord God of Israel lives, who prevented me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, Nabal wouldn't have had any men left by morning light." Then David accepted what she had brought him and said, "Go home in peace. See, I have heard what you said and have granted your request." So here's David, who completely acknowledges what she said. He admits that he's been acting badly. He admits that he got offended and that he was going to act on it in a way that did not behoove the hero of Israel, right? That this would have been bad. This would have stained his reputation, that this would have made him the villain. This would have, right, made him the evil, rebellious bandit that Saul has portrayed him to be. That he goes and takes what he wants, he steals, he kills, and so on, and that's not who he wants to be. That's not who he's supposed to be. It's not, who God wants him to be. And it has taken Abigail, right, to diffuse the situation and to keep him on the right path. This is also confirmation for me to why I think Gideon was wrong. Because if David, right, who seems to be in a similar situation where he's acting as the hero of Israel, he's trying to do the right thing, but he's found himself in a situation where he needs help. He asks for help from someone who he feels like should give him the help, and then the person offends him, right, by either promising help and not giving it or just not giving it. Then he kind of curses the guy, threatening to kill him, and then recognizes that he was wrong to do that, right? He shouldn't have cursed Nabal. He shouldn't have threatened his life. He shouldn't have just tried to take the stuff, because that's not what heroes do, right? That's not what you do if you're going to be, right, the anointed of Yahweh. But we go back to Judges 8. So in Judges 8, verse 10, "Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and with them was their army of about 15,000 men, who were all those left of the entire army of the Kedemites. Those who had been killed were 120,000 warriors. Gideon traveled on the caravan route east of Nobath and Jogbehah and attacked their army while the army was unsuspecting. Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them. He captured these two kings of Midian and routed the entire army." Verse 13. "Gideon, son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres. He captured a youth from the men of Sukkoth and interrogated him. The youth wrote down for him the names of the 77 princes and elders of Sukkoth. Then he went to the men of Sukkoth and said, 'Here are Zebah and Zalmunna. You taunted me about them, saying, Are Zebah and Zalmunna now in your power, that we should give bread to your exhausted men?' So he took the elders of the city, and he took some thorns and briars from the wilderness, and he disciplined the men of Sukkoth with them. He also tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city." So he acted on that curse, right? Even though he won the battle, even though God had turned over everything to him, even though God had preserved him, he was still going to make good on the curse and destroy these two cities. And in effect, he becomes the villain, right? He becomes the oppressor. Even though he was called to deliver Israel, now he's oppressing Israel, which is a really unfortunate kind of turn in his story. And I think David recognizes that he's going down that same path. And he doesn't want to go down that path. He realizes that this is a bad turn. He doesn't want to become the villain that Saul has painted him as. So it's hard for me to say that David is righteous here for not acting on the curse, and then to say that Gideon was also righteous for acting on the curse when the situations are just so similar. And again, I think David is really righteous here, right? He's doing the right thing by acknowledging that he was wrong and that he needed to calm down, and he shouldn't take all of his frustration on this one idiot Nabal, right? He's just let Nabal get under his skin. So in verse 36, "Then Abigail went to Nabal, and there he was in his house, holding a feast fit for a king. Nabal was in a good mood and very drunk, so she didn't say anything to him until morning light." So we already know Nabal is very wealthy. We already know that Nabal has plenty of resources, and he's throwing this banquet, and it's a situation where he could very well have invited David, right? He could have honored David. He could have helped David, but he just refuses to because he's selfish, and he's evil, and he's foolish, and so on and so forth. So then in verse 37, "In the morning when Nabal sobered up, his wife told him about these events. Then he had a seizure and became paralyzed. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal dead." So God took out Nabal, right? God enacted his own judgment because it wasn't up to David. And David acknowledged that. David accepted it, and he was willing to trust God to deal with the situation. That can be very hard for us sometimes to just try. And also, there are times when you probably want someone to just, maybe not die, but a seizure wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, and you just kind of pray, please, just give the guy one, well, just very slight, seizure, nothing permanent, maybe a little temporary paralysis or something, I don't know. But it doesn't always happen. But, precatory prayers are allowed in the Bible, I'm just saying. So, verse 39, when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise the Lord, who championed my cause against Nabal's insults and restrained his servant from doing evil. The Lord brought Nabal's evil deeds back on his own head." There's a little glee here, which maybe he shouldn't be quite as gleeful that this guy is dead, but, it's hard not to because Nabal was an idiot and he was evil. But at the same time, right, this is reassuring, right? This vindicates David. David was right not to attack Nabal. He was right not to kill Nabal and just trust God to deliver the situation. He was willing to do that with Saul. Right, earlier, he could have killed Saul and he restrained himself. He was willing to let God deal with Saul. But this was different, right? This is just some guy. And who's to say that God will take care of Nabal? He trusted God to take care of Saul, and Saul's still running around, presumably wanting to kill him. And so now he's Nabal, and David's like, well, is God going to take care of this? And you leave God to take care of one situation, the Saul situation, and then nothing happens. And then the next time comes around and you wonder, will God take care of it? Will God actually help me this time around? And maybe you don't know. Maybe you doubt. Maybe you're not sure. But in this case, David was willing to restrain himself and trust God, and God acted, right? God was willing to take care of the situation, vindicate David, judge Nabal, and so on. So if God's willing to do this with Nabal, presumably he's going to do this with Saul in the future as well. So this all plays out well. This vindicates David, and this is a reasonably happy ending, even though it's kind of sad that someone's dead. Then David sent messengers to speak to Abigail about marrying him. When David's servants came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, "David sent us to bring you to him as a wife." Well, that escalated very quickly. Oh my. Well, we already know she's beautiful, we already know she's intelligent, and she is now wealthy. So, he could definitely do worse. So in verse 41, she stood up, then bowed her face to the ground and said, "Here I am, your servant, to wash the feet of my Lord's servants." Then Abigail got up quickly, and with her 5 female servants accompanying her, rode on the donkey following David's messengers, and so she became his wife. And it's very easy for us to this is a problem with the Bible. This is one of the biggest problems with the Bible. It's just so easy to just close the book. Just end it right there. Oh, what a happy ending. Beautiful ending. That's the end of it, right? Saul will be judged. David's going to live happily ever after with Abigail. Eventually he'll be king, and it will all be wonderful, and they all live happily ever after. But that is not life, and that is not the Bible. That is not where it ends. And we just can't stop there. I've told this story before, and it just drives me crazy. I was at Falls Creek as a counselor, and the series for that week was over Samson. And as soon as he started teaching on Samson, I knew this was going to be bad. I knew it was going to be bad. It's going to be, oh boy. And of course, the week builds to the last sermon, and the last sermon, of course, is Samson in the temple of Dagon, and he builds to Samson praying to get his sight back. And he ends in the middle of the prayer, because the prayer ends, "Give me my sight back so I can have revenge for my eyes." And I take that to mean that we want Samson to have redeemed himself. We want Samson to have learned humility. We want Samson to realize that he's wrong, right? We want him to ask for forgiveness. We want to say, I've sinned, please forgive me, give me back my strength so that I can, be obedient to you, something like that. That's not what he does, because he hasn't learned anything, because he's still the same arrogant, spoiled brat he always was. But in the sermon, he just cuts off in the middle of the prayer. And he ends with Samson sort of being redeemed. And it's like, you can't do that, because that's not what's in the Bible. You have to teach the whole thing. Because again, it's so tempting to end right here with the marriage of David and Abigail. But we get verse 43. It's almost as if the Bible itself just won't give us the happy ending, because there's more going on to this. So in verse 43, David also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and the 2 of them became his wives. So you can't see it, but I've got the famous meme of the audience. They're sitting in a theater, and they all facepalm at the same time. David, 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 what are you thinking? What are you doing? You just get this beautiful, intelligent woman, and she's rich, and she's served up to you on a platter, and it's not enough. You gotta get another woman as well. Polygamy is not outlawed in the Bible, and David, of course, is going to have his little harem, but there's no good story about a guy who has more than one wife. It always ends in problems. I've got a picture here of Jacob with Leah and Rachel as just sort of the classic example, but any time you bring another woman into the picture, whether it's Hagar or Solomon with all of his wives and so on, it leads to problems. And because it's just, and I've even heard it. I've even heard this taught as, David finding his one true love. And it's like, yeah, he's found his one true love again, and he will find another one again, and another one, another one, another one. This kind of introduces us to the big failing of David, which is women, because it's never enough. And this just kind of opens that door to what will ultimately be his failure, which is why it's hard to see this story as positively as we want to, because it ends with him marrying this other woman, sort of opening the door to things are going to go downhill. And it's because of the fact that he's going to marry multiple women. And it doesn't even stop here, right? There's another woman he marries not long after this story. It's because he has all these wives and he has all these kids by these wives that there's going to be civil war, there's going to be a fight for the throne, it's going to be bloody, there's going to be all this conflict. Solomon's going to have to raise up troops against his brothers, and it's going to be bad. All because David has multiple wives and all these kids. And that's, in my opinion, not even the worst of it. Which I know, how can this get any worse? So I've got another series of slides, and it's from a TV show, but it's one guy, and he's sitting at the kitchen table, and he says, I think I forgot something. He's talking to his brother. And the brother says, well, if you forgot, then it wasn't important. And then the first brother says, yeah, you're right. And of course, that's what's in verse 44. So we've got this beautiful story about that culminates in David marrying Abigail. But then we get the additional note that he doesn't stop there. He gets another wife because Abigail wasn't enough for him. And then in verse 44, we're told, but Saul gave his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Palti, son of Laish, who was from Galim. Oh yeah, David's already married. And I've said before, and I just keep reiterating it because I think it's worth saying, Michal might be one of the most tragic characters in the Old Testament. She has a really sad life. Just to kind of go through a refresher, she is the one who wanted to marry David in the beginning, right? David defeats Goliath, and he's promised to one of Saul's daughters. Saul was going to marry him to the oldest daughter, but she was already promised to this other prince or whatever. And Michal's the one, the younger or youngest, who's in love with David. Oh man, she's just head over heels for David. And it says repeatedly that she loves David. She'll do anything for David. And so when Saul marries her off to David, she is as happy as can be because David's going to be the next champion of Israel. And of course, Jonathan's going to be king, and David's going to be the general of the armies, and she can just be the princess of Israel, and everything's going to be wonderful. And it's not, right? Because Saul goes crazy, he wants to kill David, and in the midst of all that, right, it is Michal. It's Michal who ends up helping David. She's the one who hides the statue in the bed to trick Saul. She's the one who comes up with the plan to sneak him out the window. She's the one who keeps lying to cover up for her husband because she loves David. She's willing to stand up to her father. Honestly, it seems like it's almost as much, if not more, than Jonathan's willing to do. And Jonathan, is one of his best friends. Michal seems to really be willing to go out on a limb for David, and certainly seems like much more than his other wives or women will do. Now, it seems like Saul is kind of pressuring her into this situation, but it's also curious to me that this verse comes after the fact that David's already married 2 women. So could it be that she's found out that David's already married to these other women? And how would that make you feel? If your husband, who is on the run, who's become estranged to your dad, and he's now shacking up with these 2 other women, and now your dad's kind of pressuring you to marry some other prince or some other lord, and you're just kind of caught up in the politics of the family. And it's just going to keep getting worse from there. She lives a very tragic life. She's kind of bounced around between husbands, and it just goes off from there. So the issue becomes, what should we take from this story? Because it seems like such a happy story in the beginning, right? Of David being faithful, recognizing he was wrong, and then willing to submit himself to God's authority, allowing God to judge Nabal, which results in him getting Abigail, and it all ends up happily ever after. Except that's not how it ends. He ends up marrying another woman, and he ends up losing Michal in the exchange. Michal, who seems to be the best of all of them, of all of his wives, and yet she's forced away from him. And honestly, it seems like this sort of teases, in my opinion, what will ultimately lead. It's not here yet, right? There's still plenty more positive to come. But this kind of teases what is the problem with the story of David, which is, as we've already seen, David's at his best when he's on the run. He's at his best when the resources and when he just has to rely on God. So when he's forced out of Moab and he just has to trust God, he's at his best. He saves Keilah, he gets Abiathar, and he's just completely relying on God. That's really when he's at his best, when he fights Goliath. But now that Nabal's out of the picture, God took Nabal out, well, David has kind of a moment to breathe, right? He's got resources, he's got money, he's got a wife, he's got 2 wives. And it seems like the first thing he does is he gets another wife, because he can kind of take a little comfort. He can take a little, respite. And it's in those moments where he realizes he doesn't necessarily need to rely on God that he's a little more, he's willing to branch out a bit. And it's in those moments that he tends to make the biggest mistakes. I think probably marrying multiple women is one of his mistakes because, again, they're going to lead to familial conflicts as well as children that will continue to tear the country apart. So while this is a happy story, it also kind of teases a very dark theme, which is, unfortunately, once everything starts to go right for you, that's when it's very easy to lose the reliance you had on God, and you're willing to start making mistakes. It's not that bad yet, but it will get worse, and I think we're going to stop there for tonight.
I think that even though polygamy wasn't necessarily outlawed, they knew, what God's design was. And it's evident that when they stepped outside of that design, it caused issues. Big issues, and bigger issues, and bigger issues. And Solomon died he had all those wives died 62 years old or something like that. He was fairly young. Now that I'm almost 60, that's fairly young. So, but anyway, thank you, brother. That was good. John, would you close us in prayer tonight?